Before any explanation, before any psychological, practical, or conscious concept, let this question pass through you, without haste, without an immediate answer. If you perceive anger, who are you before anger? Don't answer now, just feel the impact. Because this question doesn't seek logic, it creates an internal conflict. And every true conflict reveals something that was invisible. From an early age, we learn to define ourselves by what we feel. I'm angry. I'm anxious. That's just how I am. The problem is that silently, this language shapes our identity. The psychological becomes identity. The emotion becomes a name. And the name becomes who we believe ourselves to be. This seems practical, functional, even conscious, but it carries a subtle trap. If you are the emotion, you cannot observe it. And yet, you do observe it. Think about it honestly. When anger arises, something within you perceives the heat in your body, the tightness in your chest, the racing thoughts. There's a silent point that notices all of this happening. This point doesn't shout. It doesn't react. It doesn't justify itself. It simply perceives. And here arises the psychological and philosophical paradox that almost no one explores. How could something you perceive be who you are? This question is not new. It runs through philosophical traditions, contemplative practices, and profound reflections on the human mind. But curiously, it is rarely asked directly, because when it is asked, something begins to crumble. The certainties, the internal stories, the emotional identities that sustain suffering, conflict, and repetition. Perhaps you've experienced this without realizing it. A moment when the emotion was intense, sadness, fear, frustration, and suddenly there was a small space, an almost imperceptible interval. For a second, you weren't consumed by the emotion, you were aware of it. This instant is aesthetically minimalist, almost empty, but profoundly revealing. It shows that there is something within you that is not confused with the contents of your mind. In practical psychology, this changes everything. Because if there is an observer, then there is choice. Not forced control, not emotional repression, but applied awareness. An awareness that doesn't fight against what arises, but also doesn't get lost in it. This is a point rarely taught because it doesn't sell quick fixes. It demands presence. It demands silence. It demands an inner listening that goes beyond thought. And here begins the conflict in the story that few realize. We spend our lives trying to manage emotions, when perhaps the real movement lies in understanding who is the one who perceives them. Most approaches try to change the content of the mind. Few investigate the nature of the consciousness that observes this content. This difference seems subtle, but it is radical. It is the difference between living by reacting and living by observing. There's something almost poetic about it. Emotions come in waves. Intensity, form, duration. Some gentle, others violent. But the one who perceives the wave doesn't get wet. The one who observes the movement isn't swept away by it. This observer doesn't need to be built, improved, or trained. They're already there. The problem is that they're obscured by noise, identification, and constant narrative. Perhaps that's why this question causes discomfort, because it threatens the structure that sustains who you think you are. If you are not anger, if you are not fear, if you are not even the thoughts that narrate your life, then what remains? Don't answer yet. The goal isn't to arrive at an intellectual answer. It's to remain in the space of the question, a conscious, aesthetic, almost empty space, where something begins to reveal itself not through words, but through direct perception. Observe how your mind is trying to respond now. Observe how it creates concepts, memories, ideas, and notice who is observing this movement. This detail changes the game, because the instant you notice the observer, something shifts internally. The emotion may still be there, the thought may still arise, but the relationship with them begins to change. And it is precisely here that the next part of this reflection begins, because understanding that an observer exists is only the first step. The question that follows is even deeper and perhaps more transformative. What happens when you stop identifying with what is happening and begin to rest in what you observe? Perhaps as you listen to this, something is already stirring within you, not as a clear answer but as a conscious unease, a subtle shift in how you usually perceive yourself, and it is precisely this kind of change that begins silently. It doesn't start with major external decisions, but with a new internal stance towards one's own psychological experience. Now, I want to invite you to transform this moment into something practical and real. Don't just listen and move on. Stop for a few seconds and be honest with yourself. What changed in you when you heard this question? Even if it's confusing, even if it's just a feeling that's hard to name. This kind of insight is valuable, and it grows when it's shared. Write in the comments, what did you notice about your emotions after listening to this reflection? It doesn't need to be beautiful or philosophical. It needs to be true, because when you put that into words, you stop just reacting and start consciously observing your own mind, and that, in itself, is already a transformative movement. This channel exists for that purpose. Not to deliver ready-made answers, but to provoke real, silent, profound internal changes, psychological changes that don't come from force, but from clarity, from presence, from awareness applied to daily life. And if this content has touched you in any way, the simplest and most powerful gesture is to show it. Leave a like. It helps this type of reflection reach more people who are trapped in their own emotions, unaware that there's another perspective on life. Subscribe to the channel if you feel you need content that combines the practical with the conscious, the philosophical with the poetic, the psychological with the essential. Here, each video is an invitation to step out of autopilot and connect with something more genuine. Because this isn't just about understanding emotions. It's about changing how you relate to them. And in the next part, we'll delve deeper into exactly that. What happens when you stop fighting what you feel and begin to clearly observe what has always been there, silent, before any emotion arises. There's an invisible problem happening right now as you watch this video. It doesn't make a sound. It doesn't attract attention. It doesn't show up in clinical exams or personality tests. Yet, it influences almost every emotional decision you make. Most people have never been taught to perceive it because it disguises itself as something seemingly normal, functional, even necessary. This problem is simple to state, but profound to recognize. People believe they are what they feel. Observe how this manifests in everyday life, not as theory, but as practical and psychological experience. The emotion arises, anxiety, anger, sadness, guilt, fear, and immediately it is incorporated into identity. It's not, there is anxiety, but I am anxious. It's not, anger exists, but I am angry. The language seems harmless, but it creates a silent fusion between the observer and what is observed. And when this happens, something fundamental is lost, the space of consciousness. This is the point where suffering begins to become constant. Because emotions by nature are transient, they arise, transform, and disappear. But when you identify with them, what is fleeting gains the weight of permanence. The psychological becomes a fixed structure. The emotional state becomes the definition of who you are. And from then on, all human experience begins to be filtered through this internal label. Notice how this affects your practical life. When someone believes they are anxious, they begin to anticipate suffering. The mind creates future scenarios based on present emotions. The body reacts before the event happens. Consciousness shuts down. The same occurs with anger. When you believe you are an angry person, any stimulus becomes a trigger, any situation becomes a justification. The emotion ceases to be an event and becomes a way of existing. This mechanism is profoundly psychological, but also philosophical, because it raises an essential question about identity. Who are you when no emotion is active? Who are you in the intervals? Most people don't know the answer because they rarely remain in those spaces. There's always a story being told, a thought commenting, an emotion being felt, and little by little, consciousness becomes confused with the content of the mind. This is the suffering that doesn't show up in diagnoses, but manifests as existential weariness, a feeling of inner heaviness, repetitive patterns, and difficulty being present. It's not just the emotional pain itself that hurts, but the belief that nothing exists beyond it. When you believe that you are what you feel, there is no refuge, there is no distance, there is no observation. Everything is experienced from within the emotion, as if it were the center of your existence. And perhaps you recognize this now, in real time. Perhaps you realize how many times you've tried to resolve an emotion without questioning that identification. How many times you've sought to control, suppress, rationalize, explain, or escape it. All of this stems from the same root, the unconscious idea that if the emotion is there, it defines who you are at that moment. And this creates a continuous cycle of internal effort, resistance, and frustration. The most curious thing is that this suffering is maintained by something very subtle, the lack of conscious observation. Not observation in the sense of analyzing or judging, but of perceiving directly. When there is no clear observer, emotion occupies all the space of experience. It becomes the self, and when the self is in conflict, all of reality seems to be in conflict along with it. This pattern is culturally reinforced. We are taught to express ourselves based on what we feel, to define ourselves by emotional states, to justify behaviors based on feelings. Little is said about the consciousness that perceives these states. Little is investigated about the silence behind the mental noise. And without this investigation, the suffering continues to repeat itself, even when the person believes they are evolving or getting to know themselves better. Perhaps the most important thing here is not trying to change what you feel, but to begin to notice how you relate to what you feel. There is a difference between experiencing an emotion and being consumed by it. There is a difference between feeling sadness and becoming sadness. This difference is subtle, almost invisible, but it is in this difference that the possibility of psychological freedom and real awareness resides. As you listen to this, observe your own experience. See if any emotion is present right now. See how your mind tries to explain, agree, disagree, interpret, and realize all of this is being noticed by something within you. This something rarely receives attention. It doesn't demand effort. It doesn't shout, but it's always available. Ignoring it is what keeps the invisible suffering alive. Before we continue with this reflection, I really want to know if this resonated with you on any level, not just intellectually, but on a lived experience. At the end of the video, come back here and write something simple in the comments like, "I identify with my emotions," or "I realized I confuse what I feel with who I am," or even, "This made me think." These words are not insignificant. They are a sign of conscious presence. And sharing this helps not only you, but other people who are experiencing this same invisible conflict without knowing how to name it. And then the question appears like a silent blade, too simple to seem profound, and too profound for the mind to want to face without being distracted. If an emotion can be observed, could it be who you are? Notice how this phrase doesn't ask you to believe in anything. It doesn't demand faith, theory, or agreement. It only asks for honesty, because on a psychological and practical level, there is a huge difference between feeling and being. And the constant suffering that we carry as if it were normal often arises precisely from this confusion. When you say, "I am anxious," it seems like you are describing a fact, but if you observe carefully, you are doing something much bigger. You are defining an identity, and every identity requires maintenance. You start looking for proof, signs, justifications. The body goes into a state of alert more easily. The mind begins to narrate everything through an anxious filter. The world becomes smaller. Your choices become more reactive. This is psychological. It's practical. It's conscious. Or better said, it's almost conscious because it happens so quickly that it seems automatic. Now back to the key question. If anxiety can be perceived, if you can notice anxiety arising, growing, changing form, going away, how could it be you? "Ah, but I feel it very strongly." Yes, but feeling strongly doesn't prove identity. It proves intensity. A storm can be intense, but it's still a phenomenon passing through the sky. And when you're inside it, everything seems definitive. Emotion has this power. It creates the sensation of absolute truth. Anger seems like justice. Sadness seems like reality. Fear seems like prediction. Guilt seems like a sentence. And that's where the investigation begins, because this sensation of truth may just be the way emotion colors perception. Notice the detail. Observing is not denying. Observing is including. It's a type of conscious presence that doesn't try to solve everything with thought. In real life, what most people do is the opposite. As soon as an emotion arises, they run to the why, run to the story, run to the explanation. I am like this because, I am like this because, and the mind loves that. The mind loves to construct a narrative, because a narrative gives control, except that often this control is false. It only makes the emotion more solid, more personal, more attached to identity. The key question interrupts this process. It opens a minimalist crack within the mental noise, and in that crack, you begin to perceive something that is almost poetic in its simplicity. There is a perception before thought, before labeling, before conclusion. There is a space of awareness that notices emotion as an event that is happening. And when you see this, even for a second, you begin to recognize that the self you defend all the time may actually be a collection of sensations, memories, and stories repeating themselves. Perhaps that's why this question is uncomfortable, because it touches on what seems most intimate, me. And we protect me as if it were something fixed. But when you observe calmly, me changes mood, changes opinion, changes energy, changes desire, changes fear. Sometimes it changes in minutes. So what exactly remains? What is stable enough to be you? This is where the philosophical tone appears without needing to become complicated. Because it's not an abstract discussion, it's a direct investigation of your human experience in body, mind, and daily life. Think of a recent moment when you were irritated. At first, it might have just been an annoyance. Then it turned into tension in your face, in your jaw, a rising heat, an impulse to respond, to defend yourself, to win. If you look closely, anger is a package. Physical sensation, plus racing thoughts, plus justifying narrative, plus will to act. Now, the crucial point, can you notice this package? Can you perceive this is anger happening within me? If so, then there is something that is not the package. There is an observer. And this observer, even when forgotten, is there. And here comes an important psychological nuance. Emotion is not the problem. The problem is the fusion. Emotion is information, energy, movement. Suffering arises when emotion becomes identity, when it becomes who I am, when it becomes destiny. The key question serves to plant a seed that grows over time. The seed that you can feel deeply and still remain conscious. You can be riding a wave without drowning in its story. This is not coldness. It is not repression. It is inner maturity. It is a type of conscious mental health that does not depend on controlling life, but on knowing the mind. And in practice, how does this seed begin to germinate? It begins with micro-perceptions, small moments when you notice, there's anxiety here, instead of, I am anxious. There's sadness here, instead of, I am sad. It seems like a minimal exchange of words, but it's a gigantic exchange in your relationship with the experience. Because when you say there's sadness, you create space. When you say, I am sadness, you close space. And without space, there is no choice, only reaction. Perhaps you've already experienced something like this without naming it. Sometimes in the midst of intense emotion, you find yourself thinking, why am I like this? This why might just be another path to narrative, but it can also be the gateway to awareness. Because before the why, there is the what. What is happening now, in the body, in the mind, in the heart. And even before the what, there is the who perceives. Who is noticing all this? This is the sequence that deepens the investigation. Emotion, perception, observer. And this changes the game because it takes you out of autopilot. Now, beware of a common trap, turning the observer into just another character. The mind will try to grasp this idea and say, ah, so I am the observer, and create a spiritual identity, a more refined mask. But the investigation isn't about creating a new fantasy of self, it's about clearly seeing how the self appears and disappears. The observer is not a trophy, it's not an achievement. It's the silent background where everything appears, and the more you try to grasp it, the more it becomes a concept. That's why this approach calls for simplicity, internal minimalism, less explanation, more presence. And there's an aesthetic aspect to it, almost like a clean scene, without excess. Emotion emerges as a color, a sound, a movement. The observer is like the screen. The screen doesn't need to argue with the color. It doesn't need to expel the sound. It doesn't need to correct the movement. It simply allows it to appear and disappear. When you begin to recognize this screen, your emotional life doesn't need to become a war. You stop wasting energy trying to be someone else all the time, and you begin to learn the rarest gesture of emotional maturity: to stay, to remain, to breathe, to see. If you followed along this far, you'll realize that the key question isn't just a pretty thumbnail phrase. It's a practical tool for self-knowledge, an invitation to a type of awareness that reduces suffering without depending on controlling the external world. And that's why it plants the seed. Because after you truly ask this question, some old certainties begin to feel heavy, and the mind may even resist, saying, "This is nonsense. This is too philosophical. This doesn't solve my problems." But the investigation doesn't want to take you out of life. It wants to bring you back to life with more clarity. And from here, the conversation needs to move forward, because the question opens the door, but doesn't go through you. If an emotion can be observed, it cannot be your core. So what is this perceiving that remains? How does this appear in the Buddhist view? In mindfulness? In non-clinging awareness? That's exactly where we're going now. But first, help me understand you. Comment at the end with a short phrase in your own way, like, "I got confused by the emotion," or "I can observe, but I still get lost," or simply, "I perceived the space." If you want, also comment with just one word: observer. This tells me that you are truly following along and helps this content reach more people who need this clarity. When we begin to look at this issue from a Buddhist perspective, something changes in the tone of the conversation. Not because Buddhism brings a new belief to replace another, but because it invites a kind of direct observation of experience that is simultaneously psychological, practical, and profoundly conscious. Here, the central idea is not to fight against emotions or eliminate them. It is to understand their nature, and above all, to understand that which perceives them. In the Buddhist perspective, emotions are not enemies. They are not character flaws, nor defects of the mind. They are movements, processes, conditioned phenomena. They arise when certain causes meet: thoughts, memories, external stimuli, bodily sensations, and disappear when these conditions dissolve. This applies to joy, anger, fear, sadness, euphoria, guilt. None of them are permanent. None remain identical for long. Everything changes. Everything transforms. This impermanence is not an abstract philosophical idea. It is something you can verify now, if you observe carefully. From a Buddhist perspective, the problem lies not in the emergence of emotions, but in the automatic identification with them. When an emotion arises, the mind quickly says, "That's me," and at that instant, something essential is lost: clarity. Consciousness contracts around the emotional content, and the observer disappears from the field of vision, not because it has ceased to exist, but because it has been forgotten, as if a screen were to become one with the film being projected onto it. Buddhist practice points precisely to this forgetting. It doesn't ask you to believe in something mystical, nor to adopt a spiritual identity. It asks for something much simpler and much more challenging: to see what is happening while it is happening, to see emotion as emotion, to see thought as thought, to see sensation as sensation, and in this seeing to recognize that there is a consciousness that does not mix with what appears within it. This awareness doesn't need to be created. It's not a special state you achieve after years of practice. It's already there. What happens is that in daily life it's constantly hijacked by mental narratives. The mind tells stories all the time, about the past, about the future, about who you are, about what others have done, about what should have been different. Emotions fuel these stories, and when you fully believe in these narratives, emotion ceases to be just a passing phenomenon and becomes an absolute truth about reality. Buddhism draws attention to something simple and radical. That which is observed neither arises nor dies with the emotion. When anger arises, it is perceived. When anger passes, it is also perceived. The same happens with sadness, fear, and anxiety. Something remains constant in this process: the capacity to perceive. This perceiving has no form, no mood, no history. It doesn't get stronger or weaker depending on the day. It is simply present, silent, available. Perhaps you've never stopped to notice it this way, because, in the culture we live in, we are trained to focus on content, not context, on what we feel, not on who perceives it, on what we think, not on the consciousness that notices the thought. And this creates an intense, yet confusing emotional life. Intense because emotions are experienced forcefully. Confusing because there is a lack of inner space to understand them without getting lost in them. From a Buddhist perspective, this space is fundamental. It allows the emotion to be fully felt without transforming into chronic suffering. Suffering here is not synonymous with pain. Pain is part of the human experience. Suffering is mental repetition, resistance, rigid identification. It's when you relive the emotion even after the stimulus has passed. It's when the mind continues to feed something that, by nature, would already be dissolving. And this completely changes the relationship with conscious mental health. Because instead of trying to control every emotion, you begin to recognize patterns. You start to see how certain emotions arise under certain conditions. You begin to perceive the exact moment when the mind takes ownership of the emotion and says, "This is me." And, at that moment, something new becomes possible. Not following automatic behavior. Not following doesn't mean suppressing. It means not merging. It means allowing the emotion to exist without transforming it into identity. This is extremely practical, although it seems subtle. Because when you don't merge, you respond instead of reacting. You listen instead of attacking. You wait instead of exploding. Not because someone told you to do it, but because there is enough internal space to choose. This point is central to Buddhism. Freedom does not come from changing the external world, but from deeply understanding the mind. And understanding the mind begins by recognizing that everything that arises within it, thoughts, emotions, sensations, is impermanent. What remains is the observing consciousness. This consciousness does not need to be exalted nor transformed into something special. It only needs to be recognized. Perhaps as you listen to this, you realize that your mind is trying to understand, agree, disagree, compare with other ideas. That's okay. That's being observed too. This detail is important. Even doubt is perceived. Even resistance is perceived. Nothing escapes this silent presence. And the more you perceive this, the clearer it becomes that the observer is not in conflict with what arises. He doesn't need to fight against emotions. He doesn't need to overcome thoughts. He simply allows everything to appear and disappear. This way of looking at the human experience has something minimalist and aesthetic about it. Less effort, less internal struggle, less trying to fix oneself all the time. More clarity, more simplicity, more intimacy with what is real here and now. And it is precisely this clarity that begins to transform the relationship with emotions without needing to force them to go away. From here, the conversation begins to delve even deeper, because recognizing that something is observing is only the beginning. The next step is understanding how to observe without judging, without running away, without clinging. How to remain in that conscious space when the emotion is intense. How not to lose sight of the observer when the mind tries to take control. That's where we're heading now. And before we continue, I want to hear from you. At the end, write something simple in the comments, however it comes to mind. Emotions pass, or I had never noticed that, or just the word awareness. If you want, also comment, I'm observing. This helps me know that you've been following this investigation so far. and helps this video reach more people who are seeking exactly this kind of silent clarity. When you begin to look at emotions as phenomena, something subtle, yet crucial, shifts in your perception. Phenomenon is not identity. Phenomenon is event. Something that happens under certain conditions manifests itself for a time and inevitably transforms. This shift in perspective seems small, but it directly touches the core of human psychological suffering, because the greatest pain doesn't come from the emotion itself, but from the idea that it defines who you are. Notice how emotions behave in everyday life. They don't arise out of nowhere. There's always a set of factors, a specific thought, a memory, a frustrated expectation, an external stimulus, a bodily sensation. All of this combines, and suddenly the emotion appears, sometimes as a tightness in the chest, sometimes as a weight on the shoulders, sometimes as a strong impulse to act, speak, flee, or defend oneself. This emergence is automatic, conditioned, predictable, and precisely for that reason it is a phenomenon, not an essence. The problem begins when the mind takes this temporary phenomenon and sticks a fixed label on it. This is who I am. I've always been this way. I'll never change. These phrases seem to describe reality, but in fact they are freezing something that is fluid. They are trying to transform a flow into something solid, and this creates a constant internal conflict because you end up fighting against something that by nature would change on its own if it weren't fed. From a psychological and conscious point of view, observing emotions as temporary events completely changes the relationship with them. When you understand that emotion is an ongoing process, you stop demanding that it go away immediately. And, paradoxically, that's exactly what allows it to pass. Emotions intensify when they are rejected or appropriated as identity. They dissolve when they are recognized for what they are, transient movements of human experience. Perhaps you've already noticed this in simple moments. One day you wake up with a feeling of sadness without knowing exactly why. At the beginning of the day, it seems heavy, definitive. But as the hours go by, something changes. A meeting, a conversation, a silence, a distraction, a rest, and that sadness is no longer the same. Sometimes it's not even there anymore. What does this show? That the emotion wasn't you. It was a state passing through you. The same applies to anger. At the height of anger, everything seems urgent, fair, necessary. The mind creates perfect arguments. The body prepares for confrontation. But if you observe from a distance, you realize that the intensity rises, reaches a peak, and then begins to fall. Always. No emotion can be sustained indefinitely without being fueled by thoughts. This is essential to understand. Thought is emotional fuel. When you identify with the emotion, you feed the narrative. When you observe the emotion, you interrupt the cycle without violence. This observation is not emotional coldness. On the contrary, it's intimacy with what's happening. It's feeling the emotion in your body without turning it into a story about who you are. It's allowing emotional energy to flow without needing to justify, explain, or defend it. This is extremely practical in real life because it reduces impulsive decisions, words spoken in the heat of the moment, and repeated regrets. The Buddhist perspective calls this impermanence. Everything that arises passes. Everything that appears changes. This is not a distant concept. It is an accurate description of direct experience. Emotions come in waves. Some are quick, others longer. Some are gentle, others are intense. But none of them are static. The only thing that makes an emotion seem permanent is the continuous identification with it. It is the habit of saying, "This is me," instead of "this is happening." When you begin to see emotions as phenomena, something opens up within you. Space. Space to breathe. Space to feel without drowning. Space not to react immediately. This space is the foundation of applied awareness, of conscious mental health, of true self-knowledge. Without space, there is no choice. Without choice, there is only repetition. And here's an important point. It's not about trying to observe perfectly. There is no such thing as perfect observation. It's only about noticing when you've lost your way and returning, noticing when you've become an identity and remembering that it's a state, noticing when the mind has contracted and allowing it to expand again. That's practice. That's training. That's inner kindness. It's not rigid control. Perhaps you'll encounter resistance to this idea. The mind might say, "But I've felt this way for years." But this emotion always comes back. Yes, some emotions are recurrent, because conditions are also recurrent. Certain thought patterns, certain relationships, certain learned fears. But recurrence is not identity. A season returns every year, and yet it is not permanent. Winter does not define the planet, it merely passes through it. When you truly understand this, something begins to relax. You stop defining yourself so much. You stop explaining yourself so much. You stop carrying emotion as a personal burden. And you begin to live the emotional experience as part of the flow of life, not as a verdict on who you are. This doesn't eliminate challenges, but it changes your internal posture towards them. And notice how this connects to everything we've discussed so far. There is something that observes emotion. There is something that remains while it arises and passes. When you recognize emotion as a phenomenon, this observer becomes more evident, less obscured, less forgotten. And this prepares the ground for something even deeper, which we will explore next. How to remain an observer even when the emotion is strong, even when the mind tries to pull you back to your old identity. Before continuing, if this made sense on any level, even if confusing, leave a comment at the end with something simple, like "emotion passes," or "I am not what I feel," or just "phenomenon." If you want, also write "I am learning to observe." This helps me understand how this reflection is reaching you and makes this video reach more people who are stuck in this same cycle without knowing that there is another way to look at things. Now, so that all of this doesn't remain merely abstract, Buddhism offers a simple, almost childlike image, and precisely for that reason, so powerful. A metaphor that transcends centuries because it speaks directly to human experience, without demanding intellectual effort. The mind is the sky. Emotions are clouds, and the sky at no point fights against the clouds. It doesn't try to expel them. It doesn't argue with them. It doesn't identify with the form they take. It simply allows it. When you truly contemplate this metaphor, something begins to reorganize itself within. Because if the mind is the sky, then emotions are not mistakes, nor flaws, nor personal problems. They are temporary formations, some light, almost transparent, others dense, dark, heavy. Some pass quickly, others remain longer, but none of them define the sky. None of them alters the nature of the sky. And, most importantly, none of them threatens the existence of the sky. What often happens, however, is that we forget about the sky and begin to live as if we were only the clouds. A cloud of anxiety appears, and we immediately think, "The day is lost." A cloud of sadness forms, and the mind concludes, "Something is wrong with me." A cloud of anger arises, and everything becomes confrontation, defense, tension. At that moment, the sky disappears from consciousness, not because it has ceased to exist, but because all attention has been sucked into the shape of the cloud. This metaphor is profoundly psychological and extremely practical, because it shows that suffering doesn't arise from the presence of clouds, but from the loss of contact with the sky. When you believe you are the cloud, any change in the cloud becomes a threat to your identity. If the cloud darkens, you darken. If the cloud stirs, you stir. If the cloud takes too long to go away, you despair. And this creates a tense and exhausting relationship with your own internal experience. The sky, on the other hand, is in no hurry. It doesn't demand that the cloud go away in order to exist. It doesn't negotiate with the weather. It doesn't create stories about time. It simply sustains the space where everything happens. This is an aesthetic, minimalist, and at the same time radically liberating image, because it points to a completely different internal posture towards emotions. Allowing is not agreeing. Allowing is recognizing. When you allow an emotion, you're not saying, "This is good," or "This is fair." You're saying, "This is happening now." And that conscious acknowledgement changes everything. The emotion stops fighting you because you've stopped fighting it. The tension decreases. The body begins to relax. The mind slows down, not because the cloud has gone away, but because the sky has been remembered again. Perhaps you realize how, in practice, we do the exact opposite. We try to push the clouds away. We try to force a clear sky all the time. We want to be well, positive, productive, centered, balanced. And when a cloud appears, the mind reacts with judgment. I shouldn't be like this. This shouldn't be happening. I need to change this state. This constant struggle is exhausting. And ironically, the more you fight the cloud, the denser it becomes. The metaphor of the clouds doesn't call for passivity. It calls for conscious emotional intelligence. The sky isn't weak for allowing the cloud. It is vast. It is greater than any temporary formation. Similarly, when you recognize the space of consciousness that observes, you don't become indifferent to life. You become less reactive, clearer, more present. You continue to feel, but you don't get lost. Notice how this applies to your daily life. A difficult thought arises. It triggers an emotion. That emotion creates a physical sensation. In a few seconds, you're already inside the cloud, reacting as if it were all that exists. The practice begins when you realize there's a cloud here. That's all, without trying to dissipate it, without overanalyzing, without running away. This simple recognition is already a return to heaven. And this return is not something mystical or distant. It happens in micro moments. A conscious sigh, a second of pause before responding, a more attentive look at the body, a silent perception that the emotion is there, but you are too. This "you are too" is heaven being remembered. And the more often this happens, the more familiar this space becomes. Over time, something interesting happens. The clouds continue to appear, but the relationship changes. They don't frighten you as much. They don't hijack all your attention. They don't define the entire day. You begin to trust the sky. To trust that, regardless of the cloud's shape, there is enough space to support it. That is conscious mental health. Not the absence of emotions, but the presence of inner space. Perhaps now you can see how this metaphor is not only beautiful, but extremely functional. It reorganizes the way you position yourself in relation to your own mind. Instead of asking, "How do I make this emotion go away?" you start asking, "Where is heaven now?" And this change of question changes the entire experience. From here on, the investigation becomes even more delicate, because allowing the clouds is a start, but there comes a point where the mind tries to appropriate even this metaphor, attempting to become the sky by force. And this also becomes a subtle trap. The next step is learning to observe without transforming the observer into yet another identity, another disguised cloud. But before we move on, if this image of the sky and clouds spoke to you, please leave a comment below. It can be something simple, like, "I am the sky," or "I am learning to allow," or just the word clouds. If you want, you can also write, "I was reminded of the sky." This helps me know that this metaphor truly touched you and helps this video reach more people who are struggling with clouds without realizing they have always been the sky. At some point in this silent investigation, after perceiving emotions as phenomena and recognizing the sky behind the clouds, a presence begins to insinuate itself. It doesn't arrive announcing who it is. It doesn't introduce itself with a name. It doesn't ask for recognition. It was already here before any reflection, before any metaphor, even before you started watching this video. And the question arises almost on its own, not as an intellectual challenge, but as an inner whisper. Who is the one who perceives all this? Notice how this question is different from the previous ones. It's not pointing to a specific emotion, nor to a thought, nor to a mental state. It points to that which is present in all experiences, without ever being captured by any of them. Something perceives anger arising. Something notices sadness passing. Something observes the mind stirring, creating stories, agreeing, disagreeing, resisting. And curiously, this something doesn't change according to the content that appears. Perhaps upon hearing this, the mind will try to rush ahead and give it a name. It will try to call it consciousness, observer, true self, soul, witness. But for now, don't do that. Don't label it. Don't close it off. Because what we are pointing to here is not a concept to be believed, but an experience to be recognized. Giving it a name too early usually kills the investigation. It transforms the mystery into an idea, and the idea becomes just another passing thought. It's just a feeling. There's something you perceive. It has no form, it has no age, it has no mood. It doesn't seem to be located in a specific point of the body. It doesn't say, "I am perceiving." It simply perceives. When the mind is noisy, it perceives the noise. When the mind is quiet, it perceives the silence. When you are confused, it perceives the confusion. When you think you understand everything, it perceives that feeling of understanding. Nothing escapes it. And this detail is profoundly psychological and at the same time philosophical. Because everything you usually call I appears and disappears. Emotional states change. Thoughts come and go. Beliefs transform throughout life. Tastes change. Fears change. Even the image you have of yourself changes. But the ability to perceive all of this remains. Even now, as you listen, something is registering the words, the tone, the pauses, the internal reactions. This requires no effort. It's happening by itself. Perhaps you've never stopped to look directly at it because we weren't educated to investigate the observer. We were trained to analyze the content, to solve problems, to improve states, to correct emotions, to organize thoughts. All of this happens at cloud level. Almost no one points to the sky. And when someone does point, the mind tries to look with the wrong eyes. It tries to transform the observer into an object. It tries to hold on to them. It tries to understand them as it understands anything else. And then they escape. Because what observes cannot be observed in the same way as an object. This can create a certain discomfort, a feeling of, "I can't find it." And this discomfort is part of the process. Because you're not looking for something new. You're noticing something that has always been present. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. You can only infer from their function. You know they're there because everything is seen through them. Similarly, you recognize the observer not by their form, but by their constancy. Now observe, as this is being said, thoughts may arise saying, "That makes sense," or "That's strange," or "I've heard something similar before." Emotions may appear: curiosity, resistance, interest, skepticism. Sensations in the body may change, and something is perceiving all of this without needing to comment. This something neither opposes nor supports it. It doesn't try to convince you. It doesn't ask you to change. It is simply present. This is where many people get lost, because the mind wants to transform this perception into a new spiritual identity. It wants to say, "So I am the observer," and cling to that as a more sophisticated label. But this is still a cloud. It's still a form. It's still a story. The invitation here is more subtle, not to become the observer, but to recognize that observation is already happening, effortlessly, without merit, without achievement. In everyday life, this has enormous implications. When you begin to notice this space of perception, emotions continue to arise, but they no longer occupy everything. There's a silent background that isn't dragged along, a kind of presence that doesn't conflict. And this doesn't distance you from life. It brings you closer, because you begin to respond from clarity, not just impulse. You begin to truly listen, to feel without drowning, to act without getting lost. But this recognition is still fragile at first. The mind quickly reverts to old habits. The stories reappear. The identification returns. And that's okay. This doesn't mean you've lost the observer. He never goes away. What goes away is the memory of him. And the practice here is not to hold on to that memory, but to notice when it is lost and gently return it. Perhaps you'll realize that the more you try to intellectually understand who the observer is, the more distant they seem. And the more you relax your attempt to understand, the more evident they become. This is because they are not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be recognized. They don't require analysis, they require presence, and presence makes no noise. It's important to keep this mystery alive, because the moment you think you've fully understood it, you've closed the investigation. You've transformed something alive into a concept. And what we're doing here is exactly the opposite. Opening up space, creating conscious curiosity, allowing the question to continue echoing, without rushing for a definitive answer. It is from this point that the next step becomes possible. Learning to observe without judging, without interfering, without transforming this perception into yet another mental effort. Learning to rest in this space, while life continues to unfold, with all its clouds, movements, and challenges. It is there that practice ceases to be mere understanding, and begins to become a continuous experience. And before we move on, if anything here touched you, even if you can't exactly explain what it was, leave it in the comments at the end. It can be something simple, like who notices, or there's something here, or I felt the silence. If you want, just comment observing. This helps me know that you are truly following this investigation and helps this video reach more people who are ready to look at this mystery without needing to close it too quickly. There is a silent error that underpins almost all human psychological suffering, and it is so common that it goes unnoticed even by very conscious, reflective, intelligent people interested in self-knowledge. This error is not in feeling too much, nor in thinking too much, nor in having intense emotions. The error lies in confusing what appears in the mind with who you are. Thoughts, emotions, and internal stories begin to occupy the place of the true self without you realizing when this exchange occurs. Notice how this works at the most practical level of experience. A thought arises. It comments on something about you, about the other person, about the past, or about the future. Soon after, an emotion accompanies this thought. Perhaps tightness, fear, guilt, irritation. Then, the mind constructs a story to explain it all. A coherent, convincing narrative, almost always repeated. And without realizing it, you say internally, "That's who I am." Not as an explicit statement, but as a feeling of identity. That's where the error is complete. Thought doesn't ask permission to arise. Emotion doesn't ask if it can appear. The inner story simply presents itself as truth. And because this happens so quickly, consciousness doesn't have time to position itself. The observer disappears from the scene. The sky becomes cloud. And at that instant, you are no longer observing the experience. You are the experience. This is the point where freedom closes in and suffering begins to repeat itself. The most delicate aspect is that this error disguises itself as self-knowledge. The person says, "I know myself," but what they know are mental patterns. They say, "This is me," but what they describe is a set of recurring thoughts, habitual emotions, and old stories. This creates a rigid psychological identity, an identity based on the past, an identity that needs to be constantly defended, explained, and justified. Observe how internal narratives work. They don't just narrate facts, they interpret, judge, and anticipate. They tell you who you are, what others have done, what should have been different, and what will happen if you make the same mistake again. These stories seem intimate, personal, and unique, but if you look closely, you'll see that they follow patterns. They almost always begin with, "I am like this. It always happens to me. Nobody understands me. It shouldn't be this way." They are stories laden with emotion, and that's why they seem like absolute truth. The most common mistake is believing that these stories are the self, when in fact they are merely conditioned mental content. They were learned, reinforced, and repeated. They emerged at some point in life as an attempt at protection, adaptation, or survival, and they continue to be performed even when they no longer make sense. When you become confused by them, you begin to live within an automatic script, reacting to the same triggers, repeating the same conflicts, feeling the same pains with different names. From a conscious psychological point of view, this explains why so many people say, "I know what I should do, but I can't." Because it's not a matter of information, it's a matter of identity. As long as you believe you are the thought, the emotion, or the story, you won't have room to choose another response. You will simply follow the script. The script always seems logical when you are inside it. It only becomes questionable when observed from the outside. And here's a crucial detail. Thoughts are not facts. Emotions are not orders. Internal stories are not identity. They are events that appear in consciousness. The mistake is treating them as if they own the house, when in fact, they are visitors. Some frequent, others noisy, some polite, others intrusive, but visitors nonetheless. Perhaps you've already experienced moments where this mistake became evident. One day you deeply believe in a thought, suffer because of it, react based on it. The next day that same thought loses strength, or you see it as exaggerated. What changed? The thought itself, or the relationship with it? If the thought were the true self, it couldn't lose authority so easily. The same applies to emotions. Emotions that seemed definitive yesterday no longer make sense today, and you're still here. This is a delicate point because the mind resists. It likes to identify itself. It likes to have a clear self, even if it's a suffering self, because identity gives a sense of control, even a painful control. Letting go of this confusion isn't comfortable at first. It gives a feeling of emptiness, of not knowing exactly who you are. And this emptiness is frightening. But this emptiness isn't an absence of identity. It's an absence of illusion. Buddhism points to this very precisely. Suffering arises when you cling to what is impermanent as if it were permanent. Thoughts change, emotions change, stories change, but you insist on defining yourself by them. And in doing so, you create conflict, because something within you perceives that it is not stable, but the mind insists on treating it as if it were. When you begin to realize this mistake, you don't need to try to correct everything at once. You don't need to stop thinking, or stop feeling, or destroy your internal stories. The invitation is simpler and more profound. Don't confuse things. See thought as thought. See emotion as emotion. See the story as story. And little by little, realize that you are here before, during, and after all of them. This distinction creates a new inner space. A space where you don't need to deny your experience, but also don't need to get lost in it. A space where consciousness returns to the center. And when consciousness is present, the true self doesn't need to be defined. It is lived as presence, not as a narrative. It's important to say this clearly. The true self is not a better version of you, nor a calmer personality, nor someone who never suffers. It's not something you build. It's what remains when you stop confusing yourself with what's happening. It doesn't talk much. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't defend itself. It simply is. And realizing this doesn't happen in one grand, enlightened moment. It happens in small instants. When you notice a thought and don't follow it. When you feel an emotion and don't transform it into identity. When you perceive an old story emerging and don't automatically enter into it. These moments are silent, almost invisible, but it is in them that freedom begins to manifest itself. From here, the investigation needs to go even deeper, because it's not enough to notice the mistake. It's necessary to understand how to observe without falling into that confusion again, especially when the emotion is intense and the story seems very convincing. That's exactly what we're going to explore next, deepening this ability to observe without getting lost. And before moving on, if anything here reflected your own experience, leave a comment at the end. It can be something simple like, I get confused by my thoughts, or I saw the story, or just, this happens to me. If you want, comment with just one word, identity, or story. This helps me understand where you are in this investigation, and helps this video reach more people who still believe they are only what they think or feel. When this confusion between thoughts, emotions, and identity begins to become visible, a new impulse arises almost automatically. The impulse to fix things. The mind perceives the error and tries to correct it. Then I shouldn't feel this way. I need to change this state. I have to observe better. And it is precisely here that many people slip up again, without realizing it, because they transform observation into yet another control strategy. And the practice we are pointing to goes in the opposite direction. Observation without judgment is perhaps the simplest and most counterintuitive gesture in this entire path of conscious self-knowledge. Simple, because it doesn't require complex techniques. Counterintuitive because it goes against the mind's most ingrained habit, trying to improve, correct, solve, escape, or replace the current experience with a more comfortable one. True observation doesn't seek to change anything. It simply sees. Perceiving without trying to change means being present with what is happening now, exactly as it is, not as you would like it to be, not as you think it should be, but as it is. This seems obvious when said like this, but in practice it is rare, because there is almost always a silent judgment accompanying the experience. This is not good. This shouldn't be here. This says something bad about me. Yuri, this judgment does not appear as a clear sentence. It appears as tension, as resistance, as a rush to get out of the current state. Observation without judgment begins when you notice this resistance, when you realize that, along with the emotion, there is an attempt to escape it. When you feel that, along with the thought, comes the urge to replace it with another, more acceptable one. This perception is already part of the practice. It's not something separate. You don't need to expel judgment, you need to see it, because judgment is also a passing phenomenon. On a practical psychological level, this completely changes the relationship with the mind. Instead of engaging in an internal war, you begin to follow the movement. Emotion arises, you perceive it. Thought comments, you perceive it. The body reacts, you perceive it. Nothing needs to be forcibly interrupted. Nothing needs to be pushed away. Consciousness doesn't need to become aggressive to be clear. It is clear precisely because it doesn't fight. Perhaps you perceive a fear here, a subtle fear that if you don't try to change, you'll be stuck in that state forever. The mind says, if I allow it, it will get worse. This fear is understandable because we've been trained to believe that control is synonymous with safety. But observe carefully. How many times has mental control actually resolved a difficult emotion? How many times has it merely postponed, repressed, or transformed it into something else? Observation without judgment is not passivity. It is a profound form of inner responsibility, because you stop projecting the problem outward and begin to relate to the experience directly. You stop wasting energy trying to get rid of what you feel and start using that energy to be present. And presence, when it is real, has a natural regulatory effect, not because you sent the emotion away, but because you stopped feeding it with resistance. Notice how this works in something simple. A mild anxiety appears. If you judge it, the mind goes on alert. I can't feel this now. The body tenses, breathing changes, anxiety grows. If you observe without judgment, something different happens. You feel the anxiety in your body. You notice the rhythm of your breathing. You perceive the racing thoughts. And by not fighting it, you create space. This space doesn't immediately eliminate the anxiety, but it prevents it from becoming your identity, your story, a catastrophe. This is a central point of mindful mental health, feeling without dramatizing. Not because you minimize the emotion, but because you don't add unnecessary layers. The emotion is already what it is. The extra suffering comes from the narrative, the rejection, the constant attempt to escape. When you observe without judgment, you cut away these additional layers, and what remains is simpler, more manageable, more human. It's important to understand that this practice doesn't only happen in calm moments. It's especially challenging when the emotion is intense, strong anger, deep fear, old sadness. In these moments, the mind wants to act quickly. It wants to speak. It wants to defend itself. It wants to shut down. Observation without judgment doesn't prevent action when it's necessary, but it prevents blind reaction. It creates a small interval, a space between stimulus and response, and that interval changes everything. This space isn't something you create. It appears when you stop interfering so much, when you allow the experience to fully unfold. Often, the emotion begins to transform on its own, when it's seen clearly, not because you did something, but because you stopped overdoing it. This is profoundly Buddhist, profoundly minimalist, and profoundly practical. Perhaps you'll realize that, by observing without judgment, a feeling of vulnerability arises, as if you were defenseless, and, in a way, you are. Because judgment is a defense, history is a defense, rigid identity is a defense. Letting go of that gives the feeling of being exposed. But this exposure is not weakness. It's inner honesty. It's direct contact with experience without filters. And the more you practice this, the clearer it becomes that observation doesn't belong to the judging mind. It comes from a quieter place, a place that doesn't need to prove anything, a place that doesn't need to protect itself all the time. This place begins to become more accessible as you stop trying to fix everything that comes along. The practice, then, is not about observing better, but about interfering less. It's not about making observation a tense task, but about allowing it to happen. It's not about rigidly monitoring the mind, but about accompanying it with conscious curiosity. This curiosity is gentle. It doesn't demand immediate answers. It simply lingers. And it is from this non-judgmental observation that something even deeper begins to reveal itself. The difference between observing occasionally and resting in the observer. But that is a subsequent step, a refinement of this presence that we are cultivating now. Before we continue, if this idea of observing without trying to change resonated with you, leave a comment below. It can be something simple like, "I'm learning not to judge," or "difficult not to control," or just observing. If you want, also comment, "less struggle" or "more space." These words help keep this conversation alive and help this content reach more people who are tired of fighting with their own minds without knowing there's another way. When non-judgmental observation begins to mature, something very subtle starts to become noticeable, not as a great insight, nor as a flashy mystical experience, but as an almost imperceptible detail that has always been there. Between one thought and another, between one emotional reaction and the next, there is a micro space of silence, an interval so brief that, for years, you may have passed through it without ever consciously recognizing it. This silence is not emptiness in a negative sense. It is not the absence of life. It is the absence of noise. And most importantly, even when there is no active thought, even when no emotion is clearly manifesting, you continue to exist. Something remains. Something is present. And this profoundly changes how you understand who you are. Consider your experience now. One thought ends. Before another begins, there is a small interval. The mind usually skips this interval because it is conditioned to fill everything with content. But if you slow down your attention, you realize that this space is there. And in that space, there is no narrative, no judgment, no defined emotion. Yet there is presence, there is perception, there is awareness. This detail is revolutionary on a psychological and philosophical level because it dismantles a very old belief that you only exist when you are thinking or feeling something. The mind has become accustomed to defining itself by movement, by content, by constant activity. But this silence shows something different. It shows that existence does not depend on thought, that consciousness is not born with emotion, nor does it die when it passes. Many people believe that if the mind is silent, something bad will happen. That silence is too empty, too dangerous, too strange. But when you truly touch that microspace, you realize it is stable, neutral, safe. It demands nothing from you. It asks for no explanation. It demands no performance. It simply is. And you are there with it. This silence is not something you create. It is not the result of effort, technique, or control. It appears naturally when one thought dissolves and another has not yet arisen. The problem is that the mind, conditioned to noise, passes through it without noticing. Conscious practice is not about manufacturing silence, but about recognizing the silence that already exists. And here's a very important point. In this space, there is no active emotion. There is no sadness, no anger, no anxiety, no euphoria, and yet there is no feeling of lack. You don't disappear. You don't dissolve. This shows directly that your existence does not depend on your emotional state. Emotion can be present or absent, and something within you remains intact. This realization is profoundly liberating because it offers a rest that doesn't depend on changing external life or solving all internal problems. It shows that there is a place within the human experience where there is no conflict, not because the conflicts have been resolved, but because they are not active at that moment. And you remain whole. Perhaps you've already felt this in very simple moments. A moment of pause looking out the window. A second of silence before falling asleep. A moment when the mind briefly stops, for no apparent reason. These moments often go unnoticed because they have no story, no drama, no strong emotion associated with them. But it is precisely these moments that reveal something essential about the nature of consciousness. When you begin to recognize the silence between thoughts, your relationship with emotions changes again. They continue to arise, but they no longer seem so absolute, because you know from direct experience that there is something beyond them. You have touched a space where no emotion was present, and yet there was no absence of you. This gradually weakens the belief that you are defined by what you feel. This silence is not a fixed state either. It appears and disappears. Sometimes it's long, sometimes very short. It doesn't matter. What matters is the recognition. Once you realize it exists, the mind can no longer pretend that everything is just noise. Something was seen, something was felt, and that cannot be completely undone. It's important not to turn this silence into a rigid goal. The mind may try to hunt for silence, force it, prolong it, and in doing so, it creates more noise. Silence doesn't respond to pressure. It appears when interference diminishes, when you let thoughts finish without rushing to replace them, when you neither cling to emotion nor run from it. Silence is a side effect of presence, not a personal achievement. In everyday life, this recognition creates a more stable internal foundation. You begin to realize that, even on emotionally difficult days, there are small intervals where the intensity decreases, small breaths, small pauses. And in these breaths, you find a type of rest that doesn't depend on ideal circumstances. This is extremely relevant for conscious mental health, because it offers an internal support point that doesn't collapse with every emotional change. And perhaps most importantly, in this silence, the observer is doing nothing. He is not actively observing. He simply is. And this begins to reveal something even deeper about the nature of the observer. Something that does not move along with thoughts. Something that does not arise and disappear like emotions. Something that does not need to be sustained by the effort of the mind. It is precisely from this point that the investigation gains another layer, because recognizing the silence between thoughts opens the door to understanding why the observer does not suffer in the same way as the observed content. But this is a subsequent step, which requires even more delicacy in perception. Before we continue, if you've ever noticed this silence, even for a very brief moment, please leave a comment below. It can be something simple like, "I felt the silence," "There's a space," or "between thoughts." If you prefer, just comment "pause" or "breath." This helps me know you've been following this investigation so far and helps this video reach more people who still believe they are just the noise of their own minds. When this silence between thoughts begins to be recognized, an even more delicate understanding emerges, almost as a natural consequence of observation. The observer does not suffer. This phrase may sound strange at first, even provocative, because human experience seems so linked to suffering. But here, it is important to listen calmly, without transforming this into belief or denial of pain. We are not saying that life does not hurt. We are saying something more precise. Suffering belongs to the content of the mind, not to the consciousness that observes that content. Observe your own experience with psychological honesty. Suffering is always accompanied by something specific: a recurring thought, a returning memory, a frustrated expectation, an intense emotion, an internal story that intensifies. Suffering never appears alone, without form. It always has an object. It always has a plot. It always has an associated sensation. It lives within mental movement. It is movement. Now consider the observer, that which perceives the painful thought, that which notices the difficult emotion, that which recognizes the internal story repeating itself. Is this perception in itself in conflict? Does it suffer? Or does it merely register what is happening? This distinction is subtle, but profound. Because when you confuse the observer with the content, it seems that everything suffers at the same time. But when you begin to differentiate them, something reorganizes itself internally. Suffering needs identification to exist as continuous suffering. An emotion can hurt, yes. A loss can wound. A fear can tighten the chest. This is part of the human experience. But prolonged psychological suffering arises when the mind creates a narrative around the pain and says, "This is me. This defines my life. This will never end." It is at this moment that the content of the mind hijacks identity, and the observer disappears from the equation. When the observer is present, suffering can still be felt at the emotional level, but it doesn't transform into imprisonment. There is pain, but there is no internal collapse. There is sadness, but there is no annihilation of the sense of being. There is fear, but there is no absolute certainty of threat, because something within you is seeing all of this happening, and that which you see is not being harmed in the same way. This isn't an idea to be repeated like a mantra. It's something that needs to be directly perceived. At some point, perhaps you've already experienced this. A difficult situation, an intense emotion, and yet a part of you was strangely stable, as if silently saying, "This is happening, but I am here." This "I am here" wasn't a comforting thought. It was a presence, an inner ground. Buddhism points precisely to this when it says that consciousness is like a mirror. The mirror reflects beautiful images and difficult images. It reflects joyful scenes and painful scenes. But the mirror is not harmed by the images that appear in it. It does not break when something ugly appears. It does not cling when something pleasant appears. It simply reflects. In the same way, the observing consciousness does not carry the marks of the content that passes through it. The most common mistake is thinking that by saying the observer doesn't suffer, we are denying emotions or minimizing real pain. But that's not it. Emotions continue to be felt. Sensations continue to occur in the body. What changes is the relationship with them. When the observer is acknowledged, suffering ceases to be all-encompassing. It doesn't occupy everything. It doesn't define everything. It doesn't become the identity. This is extremely relevant to conscious mental health, because many people live trying to eliminate suffering when perhaps the wisest move is to understand where it actually happens. It happens in the thought that persists, in the emotion that is fed, in the story that repeats itself. It doesn't happen in the consciousness that sees all of this. When you try to attack suffering directly, you fight the content. When you recognize the observer, you change levels. And notice how practical this is in everyday life. A difficult thought arises. I am not enough. If you identify with it, this thought becomes suffering. If you observe it, it becomes a thought being perceived. Emotional pain may appear, but it doesn't become a sentence. A fear arises. Something bad is going to happen. If you merge with it, the body panics. If you observe it, the fear is felt, but it doesn't completely dominate. This small shift changes the entire experience. The observer does not suffer because he does not resist. He does not demand that the experience be different. He does not fight against what appears. He allows it. And this permission is not resignation, it is intelligence. Because resistance generates tension, and tension amplifies suffering. When resistance falls, suffering loses some of its strength. Not because it was fought, but because it ceased to be fueled. Perhaps you realize that upon hearing this, your mind tries to understand it conceptually. It wants to transform it into a philosophy, into an elegant explanation. But the invitation here is more intimate. It's about perceiving, at the exact moment when suffering arises, where it is happening. It's about noticing that there is something within you that knows it is suffering. And this knowledge in itself is not wounded in the same way. This recognition doesn't eliminate challenges. It doesn't make life numb. But it creates a more stable inner axis, a place from which you can navigate difficult experiences without completely losing yourself. A place that doesn't need to be built, only remembered. And the more you return to this place, the clearer it becomes that suffering isn't your core. It's a passing movement. It's important to say that this recognition doesn't happen continuously at the beginning. You will forget. You will identify with it. You will suffer again. That's part of it. The point is not to never suffer again, but to suffer without completely losing contact with the observer. Each time you remember, even after you're already involved in the story, something opens up. A little more space, a little less imprisonment, and it is precisely this space that allows for the next step in this investigation, understanding how to live from the observer's perspective amidst ordinary life, relationships, decisions, and intense emotions. How this manifests itself outside of contemplation, in real daily life. That is where we are going now. Before we continue, if this idea resonated with you in any way, please leave a comment below. It can be something simple like "suffering is content," "the observer remains intact," or "this made sense." If you prefer, you can also write "I am not the pain," or simply "observer." This helps me understand how this reflection is reaching you and helps this video reach more people who are trapped in suffering without realizing that there is an inner space that is not harmed by it. When this understanding begins to stabilize, that the observer does not suffer in the same way as the content of the mind, a paradox arises that, at first glance, seems to contradict everything we have learned about emotional control, personal growth, and even mental health. A paradox that is simple to state, but profound to experience. You don't need to eliminate emotions to be free from them. This phrase often causes strangeness because we have been trained in exactly the opposite direction. From an early age, we learn that difficult emotions are problems to be solved, states to be corrected, internal flaws to be overcome. Common logic is clear. If something hurts, eliminate it. If it bothers you, distance yourself from it. If it causes suffering, fight it. This reasoning seems practical, even intelligent, but when applied to the inner world, it creates a silent and continuous conflict. Because emotions are not external objects that you can simply remove from the room. They are part of the human experience, and the more you try to eliminate them, the stronger they become. Not out of malice, but because resistance is psychological nourishment. The liberating paradox begins to make sense when you observe it in practice. Think of an emotion you've tried to avoid many times, anxiety, for example. The more you try not to feel anxious, the more attentive you become to any sign of it. The body goes on alert. The mind begins to monitor sensations. And suddenly, anxiety is already there. Not because it defeated you, but because the struggle created the perfect conditions for it to arise. The same thing happens with sadness. When you internally say, "I can't feel this," sadness gains weight. It ceases to be a passing emotion and becomes a personal problem, a flaw, proof that something is wrong with you. From there, the mind creates stories, comparisons, judgments, and the suffering increases, not because of the sadness itself, but because of the relationship you have established with it. The liberating paradox points to another path, a path that doesn't involve elimination, but liberation from identification. Being free from an emotion doesn't mean never feeling it again. It means not being a prisoner of it. It means allowing it to exist without transforming it into identity, without transforming it into destiny, without transforming it into a fixed narrative about who you are. When you stop trying to eliminate the emotion, something curious happens. It begins to change on its own, because emotions are movements. They need tension to maintain themselves. They need history, resistance, mental repetition. When you observe without judging, when you allow without merging, the emotion loses its support. It may still be intense, but it ceases to be solid. It moves, it transforms, and often it dissolves. This is the point where many people get confused. They think that allowing is giving up, that accepting is conforming. But allowing in this context is a profound act of awareness. It's saying, "This is happening now," without adding, "and this defines me." It's being present without abandoning oneself. It's feeling without losing oneself. This requires much more inner maturity than fighting or fleeing. In the field of self-knowledge and conscious mental health, this paradox completely changes the approach. Instead of asking, "How do I make this emotion go away?" the question becomes, How can I be with this emotion without becoming it? This change in question shifts the focus of the experience. You move out of control and into presence. You move out of the internal struggle and into clarity, and notice how practical this is in real life. In an argument, for example, anger arises. If you believe you need to eliminate anger to act well, you enter into internal conflict, repress yourself, or explode. If you recognize anger as an acceptable emotion, but not as an identity, something new becomes possible. You feel the anger, but you are not controlled by it. You speak, but you don't attack. You listen, but you don't negate yourself. That is true emotional freedom. This freedom doesn't come from the absence of emotions, but from the absence of fusion. Emotion happens in the body and the mind. Consciousness observes. When these two levels don't become confused, there is choice, there is space, there is applied emotional intelligence. And this isn't theoretical, it's trainable. Every time you allow an emotion without turning it into a story, you weaken the habit of identification. Perhaps the mind still resists this. It might say, but some emotions are dangerous. If I allow it, I'll lose control. This doesn't work for me. These resistances are also understandable. They are part of conditioning. But notice, these phrases are thoughts. These fears are emotions. They too can be observed. They are not you either. The liberating paradox doesn't promise a life without pain. It promises a life with less internal imprisonment, a life where experience can flow without being constantly hindered by struggle, where consciousness doesn't need to shut itself off for protection, where you learn to trust inner space more than rigid control. And this paradox sets the stage for something even more concrete: how this freedom manifests itself in everyday life, in relationships, in small choices, in trigger moments. Because understanding this intellectually is a start, but living it day to day is another layer. It is to this layer that we are advancing now, bringing this understanding to real, human, imperfect situations. Before we continue, if this idea resonated with you, leave a comment below. It can be something simple like, I don't need to eliminate, allowing liberates, or makes sense. If you want, also comment, less struggle, more presence, or emotional freedom. These words help keep this conversation alive and help this content reach more people who still believe they will only be free when they stop feeling, without knowing that true freedom begins when they stop fighting against what they feel. When this understanding begins to move from the realm of reflection into real life, everything becomes more interesting and more challenging, because it's easy to agree with profound ideas when we are silent, listening, contemplating. The real test happens when emotion arises in the midst of daily life, in the middle of a difficult conversation, an unexpected trigger, a thought that tightens the chest. That's when the question changes tone. What really changes when you observe instead of reacting? Let's start with anger, because it's one of the quickest and most seductive emotions of the mind. Anger gives a feeling of clarity. Everything seems obvious. The other person is wrong. You are right. The body heats up. Energy rises, words become sharp. When you react automatically, anger takes control. It speaks for you. It decides for you. It acts for you. And often, it leaves traces: guilt, regret, strained relationships, inner wear and tear. Now, observe the difference when there is conscious observation. Anger arises because it will arise, but instead of turning into immediate action, it is perceived. You notice the heat in your body. You notice the contraction. You notice the racing thoughts trying to justify the reaction. This simple act of perceiving already changes everything. It doesn't eliminate the anger, but it creates an interval, a small space between the stimulus and the response. In this space, you don't become a silent monk, but you cease to be a hostage. You can choose to speak or remain silent. You can choose to wait or act. You can choose firmness without aggression. This is the practical application of conscious self-awareness. With anxiety, the change is even more visible. Anxiety lives in the future. It projects scenarios, anticipates problems, creates urgency where there is no fact yet. When you react to anxiety, you believe the mind's predictions. The body goes on alert. Breathing shortens. Attention becomes fragmented. Everything becomes a threat. When you observe, something different happens. You realize that anxiety is a set of physical sensations, repetitive thoughts, and mental images. You notice that it speaks of what if, not what is. This perception doesn't make anxiety disappear immediately, but it weakens its authority. It ceases to be an absolute truth and becomes a phenomenon happening now. In practice, this changes how you act. Instead of trying to solve every imaginary scenario, you return to what is present. Instead of rushing for immediate answers, you slow down. Instead of identifying yourself as an anxious person, you begin to perceive, there is anxiety here. This shift in internal language is profoundly psychological and extremely functional. It gives you back something that anxiety tries to steal: presence. And sadness is perhaps the emotion that most tests this approach, because sadness is often accompanied by long stories, memories, comparisons, a sense of loss, a lack of meaning. When you react to sadness, the mind creates a heavy narrative. Something is wrong with me. This won't pass. It always ends like this. And the more you get into this narrative, the deeper the sadness becomes. It ceases to be a state and becomes an identity. When you observe sadness, the experience changes in quality. You feel the weight, the weariness, the withdrawal. You allow the emotion without turning it into a sentence. You don't try to force yourself to feel better. You don't try to spiritualize the pain. You just stay. And in that staying, something happens. The sadness begins to move. Not because you wanted it to, but because you stopped blocking it with resistance and narrative. Observation restores dignity to the emotion without letting it govern your identity. The central point is this: observing is not about distancing yourself from life. It's about approaching it with greater clarity. When you observe instead of reacting, you continue to feel, but you feel with more space. You continue to live, but you live with less internal conflict. You continue to face challenges, but without carrying unnecessary layers of psychological suffering. In everyday life, this translates into small changes that add up to a lot. You realize when you're about to react impulsively and choose to breathe first. You notice when your mind starts creating an old story and don't automatically engage with it. You acknowledge difficult emotions without judging yourself for feeling them. These micro-choices may not seem revolutionary, but they are precisely what transform the internal experience over time. This practical application also brings a new kind of responsibility. You stop blaming only the external world for what you feel, and begin to take ownership of your relationship with your own mind. Not to demand more of yourself, but to get to know yourself better. You realize that you don't control the emergence of emotions, but you can profoundly transform how you relate to them. And that is true freedom. It's important to say that observing doesn't mean remaining passive in the face of injustice or painful situations. It means acting without being overwhelmed by emotion. It means setting boundaries without aggression. It means stepping away when necessary without hatred. It means speaking difficult truths without losing focus. Observation doesn't weaken action, it refines it. Over time, you begin to notice something curious. The emotions continue to come, but they become less frightening because you trust more in the inner space that sustains them. You've already seen that you can get through anger without destroying yourself, anxiety without going crazy, sadness without disappearing. This trust is not arrogance. It's intimacy with your own human experience. And it is precisely this intimacy that prepares the next step in this investigation. Because after observing emotions in real life, an even deeper question arises. What happens when you begin to live from this observer's perspective amidst routine relationships and important decisions? Not just in specific moments, but as a more stable internal foundation. That is the point we are moving towards now. Before we continue, if any of these situations resonated with you, please leave a comment below. It can be something simple like, "I reacted without realizing it. Observing changes everything." Or, "I'm going to try pausing." If you want, you can also comment with anger, anxiety, or sadness, saying which one you identify with most. Or write a short sentence like, "I'm learning to observe." This helps me understand how this content is reaching you, and helps this video reach more people who need this practical, conscious, and real change in their relationship with their own emotions. Now, without changing the rhythm of the video, without closing your eyes if you don't want to, without creating a special atmosphere, I invite you to try this in practice, right here, in the simplest way possible, not as a rigid technique, but as a conscious gesture, something that fits into real life in the middle of the day, amidst the noise. Because if this only worked in absolute silence, it wouldn't be useful for almost anyone. First step, feel what is already there. Don't look for a specific emotion. Don't force anything. Just notice. Maybe it's something clear: anxiety, tiredness, irritation, mild sadness. Maybe it's something diffuse, difficult to name. It doesn't matter. The point is not to choose the right emotion, but to recognize what is present now. Observe your body. Is there tension somewhere? Is there heaviness? Is there agitation? Is there a subtle tightness? Just acknowledge it without correcting, without overanalyzing. Now, the second step, name that emotion internally. Not to explain it, not to justify it, just to name it. Anger, anxiety, fear, sadness, or even confusion. Nothing clear, discomfort. The name doesn't need to be perfect. It only serves to create a small, conscious distance. When you name it, something changes. The emotion ceases to be completely diffuse and begins to be perceived as a specific phenomenon happening now. Pay close attention to this. By naming it, you are not distancing yourself from the emotion. You are approaching it with clarity. You are saying, "This is what is happening in this moment," without transforming it into an identity, without saying, "I am," just, "There is." Now comes the third step, the most delicate and the most transformative. Observe who perceives this emotion. Don't try to answer with words. Don't create an image. Don't force an experience. Just notice. Something in you knows that this emotion is present. Something perceives the sensation in your body. Something hears the name you gave it. This something has no defined form. It has no tension. It doesn't seem to be agitated like the emotion. It simply perceives. Just sit there for a few seconds, not trying to hold on, not trying to delve deeper, just acknowledging there is emotion, and there is perception of emotion. There is sensation, and there is something that knows the sensation. There is content, and there is awareness of the content. Perhaps the mind tries to comment, "This is strange. I'm not feeling anything. Am I doing this right?" That's okay. These comments are also being perceived. Don't fight them. Include them. Observe. Notice how everything appears within the same field of consciousness. Note something important now. The observer doesn't need to do anything. He doesn't push the emotion away. He doesn't pull it closer. He doesn't try to change it. He's simply present. And see if you can perceive this. Even if only for a very brief moment. The emotion may be there, but it doesn't occupy everything. There is space. There is room. There is something that isn't compressed along with it. Perhaps the emotion will change. Perhaps it will become clearer. Perhaps it will become softer. Perhaps nothing will change. None of these outcomes is a problem. The goal is not to evoke a specific sensation. The goal is to recognize the structure of the experience, emotion perceived, by something that perceives. This practice is too simple for the mind to appreciate at first. It seems small, almost banal, but it is precisely this simplicity that makes it powerful, because you can do it in the middle of a difficult conversation, in the middle of a repetitive thought, in the middle of an emotional crisis, not as an escape, but as conscious anchoring. And notice, you didn't need to eliminate the emotion to observe it. There was no need to solve it. There was no need to understand its origin. She simply acknowledged that she's there, and that you are too. This gesture silently changes your relationship with your mind, because every time you do it, you weaken the habit of confusing yourself with what you feel. You stop being just a reaction. You become a presence, not a perfect, constant, idealized presence, but a real, possible, human presence. Perhaps now you notice something subtle. Even as the emotion continues, there's a feeling of more inner space, or maybe just a different kind of curiosity, or maybe nothing very clear. That's okay. Practice doesn't demand immediate results. It demands perceptual honesty. The most important thing here is to understand that this is not an isolated exercise. It's a way of relating to the experience, a way that can be carried over into the next few minutes, to the next emotion, to the next difficult thought. And it is precisely from here that the investigation deepens, because an inevitable question arises. What happens when you start returning to this place repeatedly throughout the day? But before we move on, I want to know how this went for you. At the end, leave a simple comment, without elaborating too much. It could be something like, "I just observed. I felt anxiety. It was difficult." Or, "I perceived the space." If you want, comment with just one word: observer, emotion, or presence. This helps me understand how this practice is resonating with you, and helps this video reach more people who need to discover, through their own experience, that there is a conscious space even amidst emotions. At some point in this investigation, something falls into place without making a sound, not as a definitive answer, but as a silent recognition. A simple phrase begins to gain real weight, not as an idea, but as an experience. What you observe is never in conflict. This is not a pretty thought to repeat. It's an internal turning point, a shift in axis, something that changes how you understand yourself in the midst of real life. Pay close attention. Every conflict you've ever experienced had form. It had content. It had opposing sides. Thoughts against thoughts. Emotions against emotions. Desires fighting amongst themselves. Fear saying it won't work, will saying you need to go. Guilt pulling you back, impulse pushing you forward. Conflict always happens between contents of the mind. It needs narrative, opposition, tension. Now look at the observer of all this. Are they in dispute with someone? Do they need to win something? Do they need to prove a point? Or do they simply perceive that the conflict is happening? This perception changes everything, because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of consciousness. Consciousness doesn't take sides. It doesn't choose sides. It doesn't try to overcome what arises. It includes. It sustains. It allows conflict to exist without becoming the conflict. And this is not indifference. It is lucidity, because only those who are not at war can see clearly. Perhaps until now, you have spent much of your life trying to resolve internal conflicts, believing you needed to choose the right side. I have to stop feeling this way. I have to think differently. I have to be better. And this logic seems healthy, but often it only creates a more sophisticated war, a spiritualized war, a psychological war, a silent war where you fight against parts of yourself, believing that this is evolution. The insight here is different. It's not about eliminating conflict by force, but about realizing that you are not the battlefield. Conflict happens within you, but it doesn't define who you are. It arises, moves, transforms, and something within you observes all of this without getting involved in the fight. This something is not divided. It is not confused. It is not behind schedule. It is not wrong. It is simply present. When this begins to be recognized, even if in an unstable way at first, the relationship with life changes, not because the conflicts disappear, but because they lose the power to consume everything. They cease to be existential. They cease to be who I am. They become situations to be overcome, temporary processes, legitimate human experiences, but not absolute ones. This is the point where many people feel a certain relief that's hard to explain. A relief that doesn't come from an external solution, nor from a drastic decision, nor from an immediate change. It comes from the simple recognition that there is an inner place that doesn't collapse with every emotion, a place that doesn't need to be right, that doesn't need to defend itself, that doesn't need to correct itself all the time. And this place isn't distant. It's not mystical. It's not reserved for those who have meditated for decades. It reveals itself in the simplest moments, when you realize you're anxious and, for a second, don't try to change it. When you feel anger and notice that there's awareness of the anger. When you're sad and yet something within you is whole enough to perceive that sadness. These moments don't make a sound, but they transform you profoundly. What you observe is never in conflict because it is not confused by what happens. It doesn't need to agree or disagree. It doesn't need to win or lose. It doesn't need to justify its existence. And the more you recognize this, the more emotional life finds a foundation that doesn't depend on ideal circumstances, a foundation that doesn't disappear when things get tough. This insight also dismantles a very common idea, that inner peace is the absence of conflict. It is not. Inner peace is not being defined by conflict. It is being able to go through chaotic moments without completely losing touch with something broader, something that observes, sustains, and allows. Peace is not in the content of the experience, but in the relationship with it. And here it's important not to transform this insight into yet another identity. Now I am a conscious person. Now I understand. That would only be another cloud, another story. The observer doesn't need to be affirmed. He doesn't need to be defended. He doesn't need to be displayed. He can simply be recognized, repeatedly, in the midst of ordinary life. Perhaps you'll notice that, upon hearing this, something relaxes, or perhaps something resists. Both reactions are normal. A mind that has lived for a long time in conflict doesn't easily trust a war-free space. It may find it dangerous, naive, insufficient. That's okay. This distrust can also be observed. It's not who you are either. The most important thing here is not to try to maintain this insight all the time, but to return to it whenever you remember. Not as an obligation, but as a possibility. Each return deepens this trust in the observer a little more, and this trust changes the way you navigate emotions, decisions, relationships, and challenges. And it is precisely from this turning point that something new begins to take shape. Because, if what one observes is never in conflict, then how can one live from this place in a more continuous way? How can one bring this into daily life without turning it into effort? How can one allow this clarity to influence choices, words, boundaries, actions? It is this investigation that we now pursue, taking the next step with even greater delicacy. Before we continue, I really want to know if this insight resonated with you. At the end, write something simple in the comments like, "I'm not in conflict," "The observer is at peace," or "This changed something in me." If you want, comment with just one word: clarity, presence, or turning point. These words help keep this conversation alive and help this video reach more people who are tired of fighting with themselves without knowing that there is an inner place where the war doesn't happen. Now, there is nothing to understand, nothing to solve, nothing to improve. After all that has been seen, felt, recognized, the invitation is simpler and more profound. Stop searching for answers for a moment. Don't mentally move forward. Don't try to take this anywhere. Just remain. Because there is a point where the natural movement of research calls for pause, not explanation. Perhaps you realize that the mind still wants to continue. It wants to close. It wants to organize. It wants to conclude. This impulse is familiar. It stems from the habit of transforming every experience into a concept. But here, for a few seconds, we don't need that. The practice now is not to do something new. It is to rest in what is already present. Feel your body supported where it is. Observe your breath happening effortlessly. Notice sounds around you, even distant ones. And beneath all of that, notice what you are noticing. Don't name it. Don't try to locate it. Just acknowledge that there is awareness, that there is presence, that there is something stable enough to notice all of this without moving along with it. If thoughts arise, let them pass. If emotions appear, allow them to be. Nothing needs to go away for this rest to happen. Rest doesn't depend on absolute silence. It only depends on not interfering, on not pulling, on not pushing, on not becoming confused again by the content that appears. This kind of rest isn't sleep. It's not disconnection. It's a gentle, awake state, a conscious repose, a rest that doesn't come from outside, that doesn't need to be earned. It appears when you stop distancing yourself from yourself, when you stop trying to be different for a few moments. Perhaps you'll notice something curious. When you rest in the observer, there is no urgency. There is no demand. There is no expectation. There is presence. A simple, almost invisible presence. And this simplicity is what the mind ignores most, because it has no shine, no promise, no drama. But it is precisely there that something true is sustained. This rest doesn't negate life. It doesn't take you out of the world. It only changes the point from which you live. Instead of living only from the noise, you begin to live from the space that contains the noise. Instead of being carried away by each wave, you begin to recognize the ocean. And this doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little, in brief returns, in subtle memories. Perhaps this respite will only last a few seconds now, perhaps less. It doesn't matter. Don't turn this into an evaluation. What matters is the recognition. This place exists, and you can return to it, in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of anger, in the midst of sadness, in the midst of a difficult decision, in the midst of a complicated conversation, not as an escape, but as a foundation. When you rest in the observer, you don't disappear. On the contrary, something within you becomes more whole, less fragmented, less pulled in opposite directions, and even when conflict returns, because it will return, there is now an internal reference point, something you've already touched, something that isn't foreign, something that doesn't need to be explained to be real. Perhaps you'll realize that when you rest like this, a different kind of silence emerges. Not a forced silence, but a silence that coexists with sounds, thoughts, and emotions. A silence that is not the absence of life, but the absence of struggle. And this absence of struggle is profoundly restorative for conscious mental health. This closure is not an end. It is a living pause. A pause that does not close the investigation, but deepens it. Because resting in the observer is not the last step. It is the ground from which the next steps happen with greater clarity. It is from this rest that action becomes less reactive, that choices become less confused, that life begins to be lived with more presence and less internal noise. Stay here for a few moments, even while the video continues. Don't try to hold on. Don't try to prolong it. Just acknowledge when you are here and when you are no longer here. That is already practice. That is already applied awareness. That is already real self-knowledge. And before we move on, I really want to know how this ending resonated with you. At the end, leave a simple comment, almost like a written whisper. It could be, I rested, I felt a presence, there was silence, or simply, observer. If you want, write the phrase, I rested in the observer. These words aren't for me. They're for you to acknowledge that you were here, even if only for a moment. And they help this message reach other people who are searching for answers when perhaps what they need most is exactly that, to stop for a moment and rest.